Good morning, I'm Shannon Pence, and we're here today to discuss the SANS outline of the 2013 Target data breach incident, quite a notable cybersecurity breach. My name is Shannon Pence. Our professor for this college class, Enterprise Cybersecurity, is Professor Mike Gideon. Hello, next we move to our Target data breach overview. Here we talk about the 40 million credit cards that were stolen on the POS system. And then we will move to discuss the known multiple issues. Some of the issues included factors that led to the data loss. Vendors were subject to phishing attacks. There was a lack of network segregation, and of course the point of sale systems were vulnerable to memory scrapping malware, and detection strategies that are employed by Target had failed, even though they were PCI compliant. Just to repeat that again, over 11 gigabytes of data was stolen, and Target missed their internal alerts that were found in the breach. But in fact, it was so bad that they were contacted by the Department of Justice. So what we see here is that a series of steps were taken by the hacker adversary to retrieve the data from Target systems. And obviously here a breakdown and detection further increased the data loss. Well, now that we've discovered the basics here of what transpired and occurred, we can move on to discuss further what we'll cover here today. First of all, the circumstances that led up to the incident, compromises that were made in the incident itself, methods used by the intruders, weaknesses identified during the investigation, the fallout to Target, and then recommendations to prevent a reoccurrence, and then ultimately leading to the summary. Okay, so now we'll move on to any circumstances and compromises that led to this incident. We're talking about four things here: Google search interaction with vendors, vendor portal, and Microsoft detailed case studies. Those were compromises that led to the incident. Here with Google search, reconnaissance by attackers may have included a Google search that would have supplied a great deal of information about how Target interacts with vendors. Results would have revealed a vendor portal and a list of HVAC and refrigeration companies. Obviously not something you probably want to leave in the open. The reconnaissance would have revealed a detailed case study on Microsoft website that described how Target used Microsoft virtualization software, centralized name resolution, and Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager, SCCM, to deploy security patches and updates. The case study described the technical infrastructure and included the POS system information in significant detail. Again, in the open, but probably not a wise thing to do here. Next, we move to methods used by the intruders. Let me get you on the right slide. So, including malware from vendors, a password bot, vendor credentials, attack cycle to find that were used to find the vendor from the vendor's vulnerabilities, and then common network tools. So with the malware, an email containing malware was sent to a refrigeration vendor used by Target. Excuse me. Malware was installed on the vendor's machine, and may have quite possibly been the Citadel or Keystone for a password stealing bot program used. That was a derivative of Zeus banking Trojan software. The malware stole credentials to an online vendor portal. Of course, after that, that's the vendor credentials part there. And then after that, the criminals next targeted the Target system via the mechanical's credential. Vendor was a mechanical. Credentials via a vendor portal. All opened and attacked. Then we move to the attack cycle here. At this point, the attackers could have further infiltrated the network, or did further infiltrate the network. But we can only speculate that the criminals used the attack cycle, which is called Mandiant's APT1, to look and find vulnerabilities in the vendor's portal. This literally moved through the network via backdoors and reconnaissance of other vulnerable systems. Some common network tools were used to do reconnaissance once inside the network. Moving next here to our next slide, we'll discuss methods used and weaknesses found during the investigation. One of the vulnerable domain controllers was one of the key issues here. That was found by a report, and the retail attack uncovered a misconfigured system. That misconfigured system was a vulnerable domain controller that could then be used to obtain access to the point-of-sale system. Here we found another domain name resolution and point monitoring services at each retail store functioned as an autonomous unit, which again, all of the retail stores were memory, our point-of-sale credit card swipes were going into an autonomous unit and not separate units or a protected area. Once they obtained access to the necessary systems, the hackers, of course, the number of point-of-sale machines that were compromised in a short amount of time otherwise indicated that their software was likely distributed to them via an automated update process. Again, this points back to our SCCM software where they do the software updates. In that, then the malware was distributed widely. In this case, it was a hacker's custom software. So in that sense, it was undetectable to common virus scanning software systems. So here we again move further to methods used as a continuation, and the default username, of course, in this report, they also found that the data that was retrieved was retrieved using a default username and password on performance assurance for Microsoft servers. That was one of the other layered approaches and vulnerabilities. Then, of course, data was moved to a drop location by the hackers, and servers, in this case all over the world, via FTP. Then hackers retrieved the data from those drop locations, which hackers assessed. Further, while the attack was in progress, monitoring or FireEye monitoring software alerted staff in India, and then, of course, they alerted their target staff in Minneapolis. But unfortunately, the staff there either was unequipped or didn't get the information or didn't handle it correctly. And then finally, here, credit cards were then sold on the black market, compromised all those memory swipes. Next, we move to our fallout. Of course, there was a great bit of company fallout. High-ranking employees lost their jobs, including the CEO and CIO. Banks had to refund money from the stolen customers via their credit card and repay or replace cards that were, and essentially that cost around $200 million to do. More than 140 lawsuits have been since filed against Target. Then, in addition to that, states passed even stricter laws as a result of this recent breach. Well, not too recent, but you get the general idea here. That was the level of effort that this and impact it had on local industry. Of course, Target had passed PCI compliance audits, and they had otherwise indicated that they were good to go. But we can learn from Target that the breach, the compliance of the baseline standard isn't nearly enough, and PCI compliance alone is not necessarily a risk management strategy. If PCI alone drives a business security decision, for example, at the time of the breach, the current PCI standard says considerations should be made for data stored in memory, but no specific requirement was defined, right, for PCI compliance. That in and of itself should be key here. So a comprehensive approach to security should be considered for all assets, not just those under compliance. For regulations and a point-of-sale system alone would not address the root cause in this particular case of the attack, since it was a layered kind of attack. Rather than relying on legal or industry standards, right, a network admin might think about the defense in more of an in-depth, making use of multiple layers of protection, and then ultimately use critical controls, which we'll discuss here shortly. Critical controls alone would not handle this problem. Of course, we talked about them being target, target being notified of the with FireEye. But again, here we would need additional people to audit and analyze, and manage the systems so they could perform incident response. We need to look at our risk management to mitigate losses, perform organizational-wide vulnerability assessments, ID threats, and prioritize and look at industry standards. Alone, obviously, here won't cover what's needed. I think the biggest takeaway here that we can look at is that vulnerabilities are system weaknesses that can be exploited, and threats are events that are have negative consequences, right? So threats and vulnerabilities for all systems, not just those within the scope of the compliance audits, should be reviewed. Vulnerabilities are identified for all systems and need to be carefully analyzed, and then looking at the which ones are that have the highest likelihood of occurring, and then the ones that are can have the most severe consequences to a system. Important to note in this particular case that we shouldn't rely on compliance alone, like ISO 2700-1 or NIST 800 for protections on a targeted system. Next to our prevention continued. Defense critical controls. Speaking of defense, there are only some key points here that I'd like to cover. Security systems are only as good as their weakest link, and sometimes single-layered protections fail. In this particular case, that was the case. Encryption itself does not protect a system. Robust security strategy is more apt to protect your data, but simply storing the key with the data, right, or not storing the key with the data is a good start. Employing critical controls that would help prevent and detect those known attacks more effectively, and then looking at the SANS top 20 controls that are posted by SANS. I can provide a list of for you after this recording. Risk management in this case essentially just points the point of sale system as a target, but defense here applied to target alone would be using a threat modeling for data centers and networks. Might have pointed to key pivot points and revealed flaws for the administrators. Then moving to defense in depth, there was no real encryption to data stored in memory, and prevention with layers would have prevented access to the point of sale memory area. Application of whitelist would have allowed for the application listing to run on a point of sale system. Only the whitelisted applications to run on the point of sale system, and further a use of a tampering resistant security module, TRSM, would have prevented access to the memory that was hacked. And then finally, implementing security controls. Here we look at those list of controls would prevent known attacks, and each point would have been a hacker touch point that might have prevented the next and would have prevented the breach. Finally, moving here to slide 11. Despite heavy investment in monitoring, we should not rely on compliance alone. We employ other methods to prevent access. Adversaries can adapt faster than what regulations are able to put in place. And finally, a security strategy for a business should take into account the specific needs of a business, Thank you for attending.